The deafening crack of gunfire ripped through the dusty air, the acrid smell of gunpowder stinging Eliza's nostrils as she scrambled behind a dilapidated wagon wheel. Her left leg, stiff and unyielding since the childhood tumble from the hayloft, protested with a dull throb, a constant, unwelcome companion. Jedediah's guttural laugh echoed from somewhere beyond the swirling dust, a sound laced with pure, unadulterated malice. "Look at the cripple, Scurry! Can't even run like a proper woman!" Eliza gritted her teeth. The taunt, a familiar sting, momentarily overshadowed by the very real threat of the bullets whizzing past her head, kicking up little plumes of dirt. This was it. The culmination of weeks of escalating torment, the price she was paying for daring to claim the meager inheritance her aunt had left her. Black Bart Thorne wanted this land, wanted the creek that snaked through its parched soil, and he wouldn't let a limping inconvenience stand in his way. Another shot slammed into the wagon wheel, sending splinters flying. Eliza flinched, her gaze darting around the desolate landscape. The small, rundown farmhouse that was meant to be her sanctuary was now a battleground. Inside she knew Silas, the mountain man with eyes as sharp as flint and a demeanor as rugged as the peaks he'd roamed, was covering her. He'd appeared in redemption like a phantom, a silent observer of her initial humiliation, and then an unexpected protector. "Think she'll cry for her mama, Jedediah?" Another voice, belonging to one of Thorne's other thugs, drawled. "Nah," Jedediah sneered. "Probably too busy trying to keep that one good leg working overtime." The words, meant to wound, did. Eliza's hand tightened around the worn grip of the rifle Silas had given her. It was heavier than she was used to, but in her hands, it felt like a sliver of defiance in a world determined to crush her. She risked a quick glance towards the ridge overlooking her property. Just before the ambush had sprung, she'd seen a flicker of movement there, a lone figure against the horizon. Sai. He hadn't abandoned her. A wave of heat washed over her, the relentless desert sun beating down. Her throat was dry, her lungs burning. This wasn't how she'd envisioned her new life. She'd pictured quiet days tending a small garden, the satisfaction of honest labor, a respite from the pitying glances and hushed whispers. Instead, she was pinned down, fighting for her survival against a man who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle. Suddenly, a different sound cut through the gunfire, the sharp crack of a distant rifle followed by a yelp of pain. Jedediah's taunting abruptly ceased. Eliza risked another peek. One of Thorne's men had fallen, clutching his leg. A plume of smoke drifted from the ridge. Silas. Hope, a fragile butterfly she thought had long since perished, fluttered in her chest. They weren't alone. This was redemption, a town whose name mocked its reality. But Eliza had no intention of succumbing to its cruelty. She would fight for her patch of earth, for her right to exist without the shadow of her past defining her future. And maybe, just maybe, with the help of a mountain man who saw not a flaw but a unique kind of strength in her gait, she would find her own redemption in this unforgiving land. The fight had just begun. Weeks before the ambush, Eliza's arrival and redemption had been anything but triumphant. The stagecoach coughed up a cloud of dust as it lumbered to a halt in front of the dusty general store, and Eliza was the last to disembark. The journey had been arduous, every jolt and sway a painful reminder of the childhood fall that had shattered her leg and left her with a permanent limp. Stepping onto the uneven ground was a fresh wave of discomfort, but Eliza masked it with a practiced stoicism. The eyes of the townsfolk, a motley collection of weathered farmers, rough-looking cowboys and curious children, immediately fixed on her. Their gazes ranged from fleeting pity to open curiosity, but it was the snickers of a group of men lounging near the saloon that truly stung. They were Thorne's men, easily identifiable by their swagger and the way they carried themselves with an air of entitled menace. Leading them was a particularly unpleasant specimen named Jedediah, his face scarred and his eyes filled with a cruel amusement. "Well, looky here, boys," Jedediah drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Looks like someone's having a bit of trouble with their walking." His companions erupted in laughter, the sound harsh and grating in the otherwise quiet street. Eliza kept her gaze straight ahead, clutching the worn leather satchel that held her few belongings. She'd endured such taunts her entire life. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her react. Her destination was the land registrar's office, a small, dilapidated building with a peeling sign that read Pettigrew Records and Deeds. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale paper and sweat. Mr. Pettigrew, a portly man with a receding hairline slicked back with what appeared to be axle grease, barely looked up from his ledgers when Eliza entered. "Name?" he grunted. "Eliza May Thornton," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've come to claim the property left to me by my aunt, Sarah Jenkins." Pettigrew's eyes finally flickered up, scrutinizing her with a dismissive gaze that lingered on her limp. "Jenkins, you say? That little patch of scrubland out past Widow's Creek?" "Yes, sir," Eliza confirmed, producing the worn deed. Pettigrew took the document with a grunt, his eyes scanning the faded script. A flicker of something, perhaps avarice, perhaps fear, crossed his face. "Well now, Miss Thornton," he said, his tone suddenly oily. "There seems to be a complication." He cleared his throat and leaned forward conspiratorially. "A certain Mr. Bartholomew Thorne has expressed a considerable interest in that particular piece of land." Eliza's heart sank. She'd heard whispers about Thorne, the cattle baron who held redemption in his iron grip. "He's willing to make you a generous offer, of course," Pettigrew continued, his eyes darting towards the window, as if expecting Thorne himself to materialize. "Save you the trouble of settling in." He slid a thin stack of bills across the counter. Eliza stared at them. It was a pittance, barely enough to get her passage back east, let alone start a new life. "I'm not interested in selling, Mr. Pettigrew," she said, her voice firm. "My aunt left this land to me, and I intend to keep it." Pettigrew's face hardened. "You don't understand, Miss Thornton. Mr. Thorne, he gets what he wants. This is his town. Defiance is unwise." Despite the knot of fear tightening in her stomach, Eliza stood her ground. "The land is rightfully mine. I have the deed." She retrieved the document, her gaze locking with Pettigrew's. In that moment, she knew she had made an enemy, and perhaps a far more powerful one than she could imagine. As she turned to leave, she saw a figure leaning against the wall outside, shrouded in shadow. It was Silas, the mountain man, his eyes fixed on Pettigrew's office. Their gazes met briefly, and then he was gone, melting back into the dusty recesses of the street. Eliza didn't know it then, but that fleeting connection was the first thread in a lifeline she would desperately need. News traveled fast in a town the size of Redemption, especially when it involved Bartholomew Black Bart Thorne. By the time Eliza had made her way to the dilapidated farmstead that was now hers, Thorne had already been informed of her stubborn refusal. He sat on the veranda of his sprawling ranch house, a tumbler of amber liquid swirling in his hand, the vast expanse of his land stretching out before him. Thorne was a man who exuded power, from the expensive leather of his boots to the cold glint in his eyes. He had built his empire through ruthless ambition and a complete disregard for anyone who stood in his way. His foreman, a nervous man named Weasel, stood before him, recounting Pettigrew's report. Thorne listened in silence, a slow smile spreading across his face as Weasel finished. "A crippled woman, you say?" Thorne chuckled, taking a long sip from his glass. "Defying me?" He found the audacity of it almost amusing. Almost. Defiance, in any form, was a challenge to his authority, and Thorne did not tolerate challenges. "Jedediah," he called out, his voice deceptively soft. The scarred cowboy swaggered onto the veranda, his spurs jingling. "See to Miss Thornton," Thorne instructed, his smile vanishing. "Persuade her to see reason. Make her understand that some things are best left to those who are capable." He emphasized the last word with a pointed look. "And Jedediah, be thorough." Meanwhile, Eliza finally reached her inherited property. The small, weather-beaten shack sagged precariously, the roof sporting several gaping holes. The barn was little more than a skeletal frame, and the once fertile fields were overgrown with weeds. It was a far cry from the idyllic image she had conjured in her mind, but it was hers. A place where she could finally be her own mistress, away from the suffocating pity of her relatives. As she surveyed the daunting task ahead, the sound of approaching horses shattered the fragile peace. Jedediah and his men rode up in a cloud of dust, their faces grim. They circled her slowly, their eyes mocking her and the pathetic state of her property. "Changed your mind yet, little cripple?" Jedediah sneered, dismounting and swaggering towards her. He gestured dismissively at the dilapidated shack. "This ain't much of a prize, even for the likes of you." He repeated Thorne's offer, his voice laced with menace. Eliza, though her stomach churned with fear, met his gaze defiantly. "The land is not for sale." Jedediah's smile vanished. He shoved her hard, and her already compromised balance gave way. She stumbled, her bad leg buckling beneath her, and she fell heavily to the ground. The rough cowboys roared with laughter, their jeers echoing across the desolate landscape. Humiliation burned in Eliza's cheeks, but something else flickered within her, a spark of fierce, unyielding anger. As she struggled to rise, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed from the nearby ridge. A spray of dirt erupted near Jedediah's boots. He froze, his eyes widening in surprise and then dawning comprehension. Standing silhouetted against the setting sun was Silas, a long rifle held steady in his hands. His posture exuded a quiet lethality that even Jedediah, hardened by years of brutality, could not ignore. "You best leave her be," Silas's voice, though calm, carried across the distance with an unmistakable edge. Jedediah glared at the mountain man, his face contorted with rage, but the sight of the rifle and the unwavering intensity in Silas's gaze gave him pause. Muttering threats under his breath, he and his men mounted their horses and galloped away, leaving Eliza bruised and shaken, but unbroken. Silas descended the ridge, his movements surprisingly agile for a man of his size and build. He reached Eliza and offered her a hand up. His grip was firm and steady. "You all right?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. Eliza nodded, brushing the dust from her clothes. "Thank you." Silas's gaze swept over the dilapidated farmstead, assessing the damage and the sheer amount of work needed. He didn't offer platitudes or false sympathy. Instead, he pointed to a section of the leaking roof. "That needs fixin' before the next rain." He then gestured towards the overgrown fields. "And that won't clear itself." Without another word, he began to gather fallen branches, his actions speaking volumes. Eliza watched him, a sense of profound gratitude washing over her. He hadn't offered pity, he'd offered help. In the harsh reality of redemption, that was a far more precious commodity. A silent understanding passed between them, an unspoken alliance forged in the face of Thorne's cruelty. They both knew this was just the beginning of their troubles. Black Bart Thorne would not take this defiance lightly. The shadow of his power loomed large over the small, struggling farmstead, promising a storm to come. Redemption was a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and Eliza's arrival and subsequent defiance of Thorne quickly became the primary topic of conversation in the dusty streets and the dimly lit saloon. The townsfolk were a mix of hardworking individuals trying to carve out a life in the harsh West, and those who had fallen under Thorne's sway either through fear or the promise of reward. Lauschkes, the town blacksmith, was one of the former. A man with calloused hands and a perpetually somber expression, Elias had lost his family years ago when Thorne had Qiangxing seized their land, a memory that still haunted the town. He approached Eliza one afternoon as she attempted to patch a hole in her roof, his eyes filled with a quiet empathy. "Miss Thornton," he said, his voice rough from years of working the forge, "you're a brave woman, standing up to Thorne like you did." He hesitated, then offered, "If you need any repairs done to your tools or whatnot, you come see me. No charge." It was a small gesture, but in a town where Thorne's influence permeated every aspect of life, it was a significant act of solidarity. Others, however, were less forthcoming. They cast nervous glances in Eliza's direction, their whispers following her like shadows. Thorne's reach was long, and no one wanted to incur his wrath by openly associating with someone who had defied him. Even the storekeeper, a normally jovial man named Higgins, was curt and avoided eye contact when Eliza went to purchase meager supplies. Sheriff Clayton, a man whose badge seemed more for show than actual law enforcement, paid Eliza a visit a few days later. He was a tired-looking man with weary eyes, his face etched with the compromises he had made to survive in Thorne's town. "Miss Thornton," he said, leaning against the doorframe of her shack, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated interior. "I'm afraid I have to advise you to leave Redemption, for your own safety." Eliza met his gaze, her own hardening. "Mr. Thorne has no right to my land." Clayton sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Right doesn't always matter much out here, Miss Thornton. Thorne, he controls things. The law in this town is, well, let's just say it's flexible." He avoided her eyes. "He won't stop at threats. He'll make your life miserable until you give up. It's not worth it." Eliza's jaw tightened. "So the law in Redemption stands for nothing?" Clayton's face flushed slightly. "I'm just trying to be realistic. You're one woman and, forgive me for saying so, but you're disadvantaged." The word, though spoken with a semblance of sympathy, grated on Eliza. She was more than her limp. She was a survivor. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff," she said, her voice cool. "But I intend to stay." Clayton shook his head, a look of resignation on his face. "Then you're a fool, Miss Thornton. A fool." He pushed himself off the doorframe and walked away, leaving Eliza with the chilling realization that she was truly on her own. Thorne's retaliation, when it came, was insidious and designed to erode Eliza's resolve. One morning, she awoke to find her small vegetable garden, the first seeds of her new life, trampled into the dust. The fragile sprouts, nurtured with care, were crushed and lifeless. A wave of despair washed over her, but beneath it, the spark of anger ignited again. A few days later, the well, her only source of fresh water, was fouled. The stench of decay hung heavy in the air. Someone had thrown a dead animal into it, rendering it unusable. This was more than just intimidation. It was an attack on her very ability to survive. Eliza felt a surge of panic. Alone, with no reliable source of water, she wouldn't last long in this harsh environment. It was Silas who found her by the tainted well, her shoulders slumped in defeat. He surveyed the damage with a grim expression. "They aim to starve you out," he said, his voice low, "or drive you away with fear." He didn't offer empty comfort. Instead, he set about the grim task of cleaning out the well. It was backbreaking work, and Eliza, despite her limp, insisted on helping. As they worked side by side, a silent understanding deepened between them. They were both outsiders in their own way, facing a common enemy. Once the well was cleared, Silas began to teach Eliza the skills she would need to survive. He showed her how to track game, how to identify edible plants, and how to find alternative sources of water in the unforgiving landscape. He was a demanding teacher, his lessons often grueling, but he pushed her because he saw a resilience in her that she herself was only beginning to recognize. The most crucial lesson was how to handle a rifle. Silas provided her with an old but reliable Winchester, showing her how to load, aim, and fire. Her limp made it difficult to maintain a steady stance, and the recoil of the rifle sent jolts of pain through her leg. Frustration often threatened to overwhelm her, but Silas's patient but firm instruction kept her going. He taught her to breathe, to focus, to compensate for her physical limitations. He never mentioned her limp, never treated her as if she were incapable. He simply taught her how to survive in a world that cared little for weakness. The seeds of a standoff were sown, not just in Eliza's defiant spirit, but in the growing partnership with the taciturn mountain man. They were two against a town, against a powerful and ruthless enemy, and the only weapons they had were resilience, skill, and an unspoken bond forged in the crucible of adversity. Eliza knew she couldn't remain isolated on her farmstead indefinitely. She needed supplies, and she needed to understand the extent of Thorne's plans. Reluctantly, she made the difficult journey back into Redemption. The familiar stares and whispers followed her as she walked down the dusty street, each step a painful reminder of her vulnerability. She entered the saloon, the swinging doors creaking open to reveal a dimly lit interior filled with the boisterous laughter of cowboys and the clinking of glasses. Jedediah and his men were holding court at their usual table, their eyes immediately locking onto Eliza. Their taunts began anew, sharper and more aggressive than before. Well, well, look what the cat dragged in, Jedediah sneered, taking a swig of whiskey. Didn't think you'd dare show your face in town again, Limpy. Eliza ignored them, her gaze scanning the room. She needed to be discreet. As she approached the bar, a young woman with fiery red hair and kind eyes, a saloon girl named May, brushed past her, seemingly by accident. A small, folded piece of paper was pressed into Eliza's hand. May gave her a quick, almost imperceptible nod before continuing to serve drinks. Eliza retreated to a quiet corner and unfolded the note. The handwriting was hurried and slightly smudged. They're planning to take your land by force. Thorne's furious. He's been asking about the creek, something secret there. Be careful. The simple message sent a chill down Eliza's spine. Thorne wasn't just trying to intimidate her, he was planning something more drastic. The mention of a secret connected to the creek sparked a flicker of curiosity. What could be so important about that small, insignificant stream? Later that day, Sheriff Clayton found Eliza outside the general store, ostensibly keeping an eye on things. His usual weariness seemed even more pronounced, his eyes shadowed with a burden Eliza couldn't quite decipher. "Miss Thornton?" he said quietly, his gaze darting around nervously. I heard about what happened to your well. That's not right." Eliza simply nodded, her expression guarded. She wasn't sure if she could trust him. Clayton hesitated, then continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thorne. He's not a reasonable man. He's got his hooks deep in this town. I can't do much openly." He looked away, shame evident in his posture. Later that night, Eliza was startled by a soft thud on her porch. She cautiously opened the door to find a small wooden box sitting just outside. Inside were several boxes of rifle cartridges. No note, no explanation. But Eliza knew who had left them. Sheriff Clayton's silent act of rebellion, however small, offered a glimmer of hope in the encroaching darkness. The cryptic message from May and Clayton's quiet support fueled Eliza's determination. She needed to understand what Thorne was after. The secret of the creek. It was while practicing her shooting, under Silas's watchful eye, that the pieces began to fall into place in a way she never expected. Her limp continued to plague her, making it difficult to maintain a stable stance. She missed shot after shot, frustration building with each errant bullet. Finally, she threw down the rifle in exasperation. "I can't do it," she said, her voice tight with defeat. "This leg, it just won't cooperate." Silas, who had been observing her with his usual stoicism, stepped forward. He picked up the rifle and examined it, then looked at Eliza, his gaze intense. "You're fighting it," he said simply. "Fighting what?" Eliza retorted, her voice laced with sarcasm. "The fact that I can't stand straight?" Silas shook his head slowly. "You're fighting the way you move. You're trying to be someone you're not." He then did something Eliza never expected. He began to move, his movement surprisingly fluid for his large frame. He incorporated a slight dip and sway, a subtle shift in his weight that seemed to flow with an almost dance-like rhythm. It was reminiscent of Eliza's own uneven gait. "You don't limp when you walk," he said, his voice low and steady. "You have a rhythm. They see a weakness, something to mock. But I see something else. Something, unpredictable." He picked up the rifle again and demonstrated, his movements incorporating the subtle sway. He explained how the slight shift in balance could actually make her a more difficult target, how her natural rhythm could throw off an opponent's aim. "Use it," he instructed. "Don't fight it. Make it part of your stance. You don't limp when you shoot, Eliza. You dance. A perfect dance they won't see coming." His words struck a deep chord within her. For the first time in her life, her flaw was not seen as a deficiency, but as a unique attribute, a potential strength. A slow dawning of understanding spread across her face. She picked up the rifle again, a newfound confidence replacing her earlier frustration. She began to practice with a different approach, no longer trying to force her body into a conventional stance, but embracing her natural rhythm. Her movements became more fluid, more sahaj. Her aim steadied. The bullets began to find their mark with increasing accuracy. Silas watched her, a rare hint of satisfaction in his eyes. In that dusty clearing, under the watchful gaze of the mountain man, Eliza began to transform. The limp that had been a source of shame and ridicule was becoming a part of her power. She was learning to dance with the gun, a deadly and unpredictable ballet born of necessity and a mountain man's unexpected insight. The secret of the creek still remained elusive, but Eliza now knew that whatever lay ahead, she would face it with a strength she never knew she possessed. The whispers of mockery might still echo in her memory, but now they were being drowned out by the sharp crack of gunfire and the steady rhythm of a woman finding her power in the most unlikely of ways. Driven by May's warning and the cryptic mention of a secret connected to the creek, Eliza and Silas began to explore the small waterway that meandered through her property. It was a seemingly insignificant stream, barely more than a trickle in places, but Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that it held the key to Thorne's interest in her land. While tracking a deer one afternoon, they stumbled upon signs of recent activity near a bend in the creek. Footprints, different from Thorne's men or the local wildlife, marked the muddy bank. Silas, ever watchful, motioned for Eliza to stay behind him, his hand resting on the butt of his rifle. Rounding the bend, they came face to face with a small group of men, rough-looking and heavily armed. They were clearly bandits, their clothing and demeanor betraying a life lived outside the bounds of the law. Their leader, a man with a scarred face and piercing dark eyes named Joaquin, stepped forward. A tense standoff ensued, neither side willing to make the first move. The air crackled with unspoken threat. Finally, Joaquin spoke, his voice surprisingly smooth despite his rugged appearance. "Well now, look what we have here," he said, his gaze shifting between Eliza and Silas. "Trespassing on our territory, are we?" Silas's hand tightened on his rifle. "This is Miss Thornton's land." Joaquin's eyes narrowed. "Thornton? The one Black Bart's been sniffing around?" A wry smile touched his lips. "Seems we have a mutual acquaintance, or rather, a mutual enemy." This unexpected connection eased the tension slightly. Joaquin explained that his band had been using the area as a temporary hideout, trying to stay out of Thorne's reach. He and Thorne had a long and bloody history, a rivalry born of stolen cattle and double crosses. As they talked, Joaquin let slip a rumor he had heard, that the creek on Eliza's land wasn't just a creek. Locals whispered of a hidden spring, a reliable source of water that had sustained a long-forgotten settlement. In this arid land, water was more valuable than gold. This revelation clicked with May's warning and Thorne's relentless pursuit of her land. The complication Pettigrew had mentioned, Thorne's interest, it all pointed to this hidden spring. With Joaquin and his men keeping a watchful distance, Eliza and Silas began to search the banks of the creek more thoroughly. They followed its winding path, Silas's keen eyes spotting subtle signs, unusual rock formations, patches of unexpectedly lush vegetation. Finally, they found it, hidden behind a thicket of willows, a small, crystal-clear pool of water bubbling up from the earth. Nearby, almost swallowed by the undergrowth, they discovered the crumbling ruins of an old settlement. Weathered stone foundations hinted at what had once been homes and buildings. And then, Eliza spotted it, a leather-bound journal half buried in the dirt. Its pages were brittle and yellowed with age, but the ink, miraculously, was still legible. The journal belonged to one of the original settlers, and its entries told a horrifying story. The settlement had thrived for a brief period, thanks to the reliable spring. But then Thorne had come. He had coveted their water source, and when they refused to sell, he had orchestrated a brutal massacre, wiping out the entire community to claim the spring for himself. The journal ended abruptly, the last entry filled with terror. Eliza felt a wave of nausea and fury wash over her. Thorne hadn't just been greedy. He was a murderer, and his entire empire was built on a foundation of lies and bloodshed. The creek on her land wasn't just a source of water. It was a silent testament to his monstrous cruelty. As they absorbed this horrifying truth, the crack of a twig underfoot shattered the silence. One of Thorne's patrols, likely searching for Eliza, had stumbled upon them. There was no time to hide. A shout went up, and the sound of approaching horses filled the air. "We need to move!" Silas barked, grabbing Eliza's arm. A desperate chase ensued, Eliza's limp hampering her progress, but her fear lending her a surge of adrenaline. They scrambled through the underbrush, bullets whizzing past them. Silas returned fire, his shots precise and deadly. Reaching a rocky outcrop, they made a brief stand, exchanging gunfire with Thorne's men. Eliza, remembering Silas's lessons, found her rhythm, her movements fluid and unpredictable. She managed to take down one of the riders, her shot surprisingly accurate. They eventually managed to break free, disappearing into the dense woods. But they knew they couldn't outrun Thorne indefinitely. He would be furious that his secret was out, and he would stop at nothing to silence them and reclaim his control over the spring. The rising action had reached its peak. Eliza was no longer just fighting for her land. She was fighting for justice for the dead, to expose a monster, and to survive the inevitable storm that was about to break over redemption. The quiet defiance had ignited a war, and Eliza, the woman once mocked for her limp, was now standing at the heart of it all. The hidden truth had raised the stakes to a deadly new level.